Hey everyone, and welcome to Adult Storytime. Storytime for adults. I'm your host, Katie, and today I'm going to be reading you an excerpt from the book The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And this was Oprah's book club pick of 2019, so you know it's going to be good. And you've probably heard of Ta-Nehisi Coates. But I'd love to share a little bit more about him as well. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a distinguished writer in residence at NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. He is the author of the best-selling books, The Beautiful Struggle, We Were 8 Years in Power, and Between the World and Me, which won the National Book Award in 2015. His first novel, The Water Dancer, was released in September 2019. And here's where you might know him from best. He is also the current author of the Marvel Comics The Black Panther and Captain America. Okay. Part 1. My part has been to tell the story of the slave. The story of the master never wanted for narrators. Frederick Douglass. Chapter 1. And I could only have seen her there on the stone bridge, a dancer wreathed in ghostly blue, because that was the way they would have taken her back when I was young, back when the Virginia earth was still red as brick and red with life. And though there were other bridges spanning the River Goose, they would have bound her and brought her across this one, because this was the bridge that fed into the turnpike that twisted its way through the green hills and down the valley before bending in one direction. And that direction was south. I had always avoided that bridge, for it was stained with the remembrance of the mothers, uncles, and cousins gone Natchez way. But knowing now the awesome power of memory, how it can open a blue door from one world to another, how it can move us from mountains to meadows, from green woods to fields caked in snow, knowing now that memory can fold the land like cloth, and knowing, too, how I had pushed my memory of her into the down there of my mind, how I forgot, but did not forget. I know now that this story, this conduction, had to begin there on that fantastic bridge between the land of the living and the land of the lost. And she was patting Juba on the bridge, an earthen jar on her head, a great mist rising from the river below, nipping at her bare heels, which pounded the cobblestones, causing her necklace of shells to shake. The earthen jar did not move. It seemed almost a part of her, so that no matter her high knees, no matter her dips and bends, her splaying arms, the jar stayed fixed on her head like a crown. And seeing this incredible feat, I knew that the woman patting Juba, wreathed in ghostly blue, was my mother. No one else saw her. Not Maynard, who was then in the back of the new Millennium Chase, not the fancy girl who held him wrapped with her wiles, and most strange, not the horse, though I had been told that horses had a nose for things that stray out from other worlds and stumble into ours. No, only I saw her from the driver's seat of the chase, and she was just as they described her, just as they'd said she'd been in the olden days when she would leap into a circle of all my people, Aunt Emma, young P, Honus, and Uncle John, and they would clap, pound their chests, and slap their knees, urging her on in double time, and she would stomp the dirt floor hard, as if crushing a crawling thing under her heel, and bend at the hips and bow, then twist and wind her bent knees in union with her hands, the earthen jar still on her head. My mother was the best dancer at Lochless. That is what they told me, and I remembered this because she'd gifted me with none of it, but more I remembered because it was dancing that brought her to the attention of my father, and thus had brought me to be. And more than that, I remembered because I remembered everything. Everything, it seemed, except her. It was autumn now, the season when the races came south. That afternoon, Maynard had scored on a long-shot thoroughbred, and thought this might, at last, win the esteem of Virginia quality he sought. But when he made the circuit around the great town square, leaning back, way back in the chase and grinning large, The men of society turned their backs to him and puffed on their cigars. There were no salutes. He was what he would always be. Maynard the goof, Maynard the lame, Maynard the fool, the rotten apple who'd fallen many miles from the tree. He fumed and had me drive to the old house at the edge of our town, Starfall, where he purchased himself a night with a fancy and had the bright notion to bring her back to the big house at Lochless, and most fatefully, in a sudden bout of shame, insisted on leaving the back way out of town, down Dumb Silk Road, until it connected with that old turnpike, which led us back to the bank of the River Goose. A cold, steady rain fell as I drove, the water dripping down from the brim of my hat, puddling on my trousers. I could hear Maynard in the back, with all his games, putting his carnal boasts upon the fancy. I was pushing the horse as hard as I could, because all I wanted was to be home and free of Maynard's voice, though I could never, in this life, be free of him. Maynard, who held my chain. Maynard, my brother, who was made my master. And I was trying all I could to not hear, searching for distraction. Memories of corn shucking or young games of blind man's bluff. What I remember is how those distractions never came, but instead there was a sudden silence, erasing not just Maynard's voice, but all the small sounds of the world around. And now, peering into the pigeonhole of my mind, what I found were remembrances of the lost. Men holding strong on watch night, and women taking their last tour of the apple orchards, spinsters remanding their own gardens to others, old codgers cursing the great house of Lochless, legions of the lost brought across that baleful bridge, legions embodied in my dancing mother. I yanked the reins, but it was too late. We barreled right through, and what happened next shook forever my sense of cosmic order. But I was there and saw it happen, and have since seen a great many things that expose the ends of our knowledge and how much more lies beyond it. The road beneath the wheels disappeared, and the whole of the bridge fell away, and for a moment I felt myself floating on, or maybe in, the blue light. And it was warm there, and I remember that brief warmth because just as suddenly as I floated out, I was in the water, under the water, and even as I tell you this now, I feel myself back there again in the icy bite of that river goose, the water rushing into me, and that particular burning agony that comes only to the drowning. There is no sensation like drowning because the feeling is not merely the agony, but a bewilderment at so alien a circumstance. The mind believes that there should be air, since there is always air to be had, and the urge to breathe is such a matter of instinct that it requires a kind of focus to belay the order. Had I leapt from the bridge myself, I could have accounted for my new situation. Had I even fallen over the side, I would have understood, if only because this would have been imaginable. But it was as though I had been shoved out of a window right into the depths of the river. There was no warning. I kept trying to breathe. I remember crying out for breath, and more I remember the agony of the answer, the agony of water rushing into me, and how I answered that agony by heaving, which only invited more water. But somehow I steadied my thoughts, and somehow I came to understand that all my thrashing could only but hasten my demise. And with that accomplished, I noted that there was light in one direction, and darkness in another, and deduced that the dark was the depths and the light was not. I whipped my legs behind me and stretched out my arms toward the light, pulling the water until, at last, coughing, retching, I surfaced. And when I came up, breaking through dark water and into the diorama of the world, storm clouds hung by unseen thread, a red sun pinned low against them, and beneath that sun, hills dusted with grass. I looked back at the stone bridge, which must have been, my God, a half-mile away. The bridge seemed to be almost racing away from me, because the current pulled me along, and when I angled myself to swim toward the shore, it was that current still, or perhaps some unseen eddy beneath, pulling me down river. There was no sign of the woman whose time Maynard had so thoughtlessly purchased. But whatever thoughts I had on her behalf were broken by Maynard making himself known, as he had so often, with hue and cry, determined to go out of this world in the self-same manner that he had passed through it. He was close by, pulled by the same current. He thrashed in the current, yelled, treaded a bit, and then disappeared under, only to reappear again seconds later, yelling, half-treading, thrashing. "Help me high!" There I was, my own life dangling over the black pit, and now being called to save another. I had, on many occasions, tried to teach Maynard to swim, and he took to this instruction as he took to all instruction, careless and remiss at the labor, then sore and bigoted when this negligence bore no fruit. I can now say that slavery murdered him, that slavery made a child of him, and now, dropped into a world where slavery held no sway, Maynard was dead the minute he touched water. I had always been his protection. It was I, only by good humor and debasement, who had kept Charles Lee from shooting him. And it was I, with special appeal to our father, who had kept him countless times from wrath. And it was I who clothed him every morning, and I who put him to bed every night. And it was I who now was tired, in both body and soul. And it was I, out there, wrestling against the pull of the current, against the fantastic events that had deposited me there, and now wrestling with the demand that I once again save another, when I could not even conjure the energy to save myself. "Help me!" he yelled again, and then he cried out, "Please!" He said it like the child he always was, begging. And I noted, however uncharitably, even there in the goose facing my own death, that I had never before recalled him speaking in a manner that reflected the true nature of our positions. "Please!" "I can't," I yelled over the water. "We are under the ox." With that admission of imminent death, memories of my life descended on me unbidden, and now the same blue light that I'd seen on the bridge returned and enveloped me again. I thought back to Lochless and all my loved ones, and right there in the middle of the misty river I saw Thena, on wash day, an old woman heaving the large pots of steaming water and, with the last of her powers, threshing the dripping garments until they were damp and her hands were raw. And I saw Sophia in her gloves and bonnet, like a woman of mastery, because that is what her task required of her, and I watched, as I had so many times before, as she hiked the bell of her dress to her ankles and walked down a back path to see the man who held her chained. I felt my limbs submit, and the mystery and confusion of the events that had deposited me into the depths nagged me no longer. And this time, when I went under, there was no burning, no straining for breath. I felt weightless, so that even as I sank into the river, I felt myself rising into something else. The water fell away from me, and I was alone in a warm blue pocket, with the river outside me and around me. And I knew then that I was, at last, going to my reward. My mind journeyed further back, still, to those who'd been carried out of this Virginia, out Natchez way, and I wondered how many of them might well have gone further still, far enough to greet me in that next world I now approached. And I saw my Aunt Emma, who worked the kitchen for all those years, walking past with a tray of ginger cookies for all the assembled walkers, though none for her or any of her kin. Perhaps my mother would be there, and then at the speed of thought I saw her flittering before my eyes, water dancing in the ring. And thinking of all this, of all the stories, I was at peace, and pleased even to rise into the darkness, to fall into the light. There was peace in that blue light, more peace than sleep itself, and more than that there was freedom. And I knew that the elders had not lied, that there really was a home place of our own, a life beyond the task, where every moment is as daybreak over mountains. And so great was this freedom that I became aware of a nagging weight that I had always taken as unchangeable, a weight that now proposed to follow me into the forever. I turned, and in my wake I saw the weight, and the weight was my brother, howling, thrashing, screaming, pleading for his life. All my life I had been subject to his whims. I was his right arm and thus had no arm of my own. But that was all over now, because I was rising out of that world of the quality and the tasked. My last sight of Maynard was of him thrashing in the water and grappling after what he could no longer hold, until he began to blur before me, like light rippling on a wave, and his cries diminished beneath the loud nothing all around me. And then he was gone. I would like to say that I mourned right then, or took some manner of note, but I did not. I was headed to my ending. He was headed to his. The apparitions now steadied before me, and I focused on my mother, who was no longer dancing, but instead kneeling before a boy. And she put her hand upon the boy's cheek, and she kissed him on his head, and she placed the shell necklace in his hand, and closed his hand around the thing, and then she stood with both hands over her mouth, and she turned and walked off into the distance. And the boy stood there watching, and then cried after her, and then followed after her, and then ran after her, and then fell as he ran, and lay there crying into his arms, and then stood again and turned, this time toward me, and walking over, he opened his hand and offered the necklace, and I saw, at long last, my reward. So that was chapter 1 of The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I wanted to share a little bit more information about Ta-Nehisi Coates and The Water Dancer. So here is the synopsis of The Water Dancer. A boldly imagined work of magic and adventure from the National Book Award-winning author of Between the World and Me. Young Hiram Walker was born into bondage and lost his mother and all memory of her when he was a child, but he is also gifted with a mysterious power. Hiram almost drowns when he crashes a carriage into a river, but is saved from the depths by a force he doesn't understand, a blue light that lifts him up and lands him a mile away. This strange brush with death forces a new urgency on Hiram's private rebellion. Spurred on by his impoverished plantation family, Thena, his chosen mother, a woman of few words and many secrets, and Sophia, a young woman fighting her own war, even as she and Hiram fall in love, he becomes determined to escape the only home he's ever known. And I hope you enjoyed that little sneak peek into The Water Dancer, which should prove to be a very magical book. I know it's available for you to check out on Libby, but we are now also open for holds and hold pickup. So if you want to put that book on hold, pick it up from the library, you can go ahead and do that now from your account. Yay! Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye!